The drone feed flickered once, then locked. On the screen, a Russian BMP-3 had stopped moving. Its left track blown clean off by a mine buried 3 weeks earlier by sappers from the 79th Brigade. The vehicle sat at the mouth of a slag heap access road, 300 meters from the nearest Ukrainian position, smoke beginning to curl from its engine deck. The crew had 60 seconds to make a decision. What they chose next would cost Russia an entire armored company before nightfall. This is Vuhledar, and what happened here is one of the most documented armor loss events of the entire war. Over the next 34 minutes, you're going to watch how a single Ukrainian brigade transformed a dying coal town into an anti-tank killing field, so effective that Russian commanders sent regiment after regiment into the same approach corridors and received burning wreckage in return. The numbers, confirmed through Oryx open-source data and satellite imagery from Maxar, are almost difficult to believe. Almost. The central question: how does a brigade holding an exposed salient, outnumbered and under constant fire, turn industrial ruin into a force multiplier that grinds down an entire Russian naval infantry formation? The answer begins not with tactics, but with coal. Vuhledar sits at roughly 200 meters elevation above the surrounding steppe in Donetsk Oblast, about 50 kilometers southwest of the city of Donetsk. In peacetime, it was a company town, population under 14,000, built to service the Donbas mine complex, a network of shafts and processing facilities whose surface infrastructure includes reinforced concrete headframes, coal sorting facilities with 2-meter-thick walls, and slag heaps, the mountains of waste rock pulled from underground, rising 15 to 20 meters above the flat ground around them. When Russia's full-scale invasion began in February 2022, the Ukrainian military recognized immediately what any competent defender would recognize. This terrain is a gift. The slag heaps are natural observation towers. The mine buildings are pre-built bunkers. The access roads between the heaps funnel armored vehicles into predictable lines of advance, and the elevated position gives defenders line of sight across the steppe for 3 to 5 kilometers in every direction. The unit assigned to hold it was the 79th Separate Air Assault Brigade, a formation based in Mykolaiv with roots in Soviet airborne doctrine. By 2022, it had been refashioned into a combined arms force capable of both offensive air assault operations and sustained defensive fighting. They would need every skill they had. Russia's plan for Vuhledar was straightforward in the way most Russian plans in this phase of the war were straightforward: mass, pressure, and repetition. The primary formation tasked with taking the town was the 155th Separate Naval Infantry Brigade of the Pacific Fleet, reinforced at various points by elements of the 40th Separate Naval Infantry Brigade. These were not second-line conscript units. The 155th was a professional formation with combat experience and modern equipment. On paper, the correlation of forces should have produced a Russian breakthrough within weeks. It did not produce a breakthrough. It produced a graveyard. Here's what the satellite record shows. The approaches to Vuhledar from the east and southeast offer 2 primary corridors for armored vehicles. The first runs along a road from Pavlivka through the village of Mikilske toward the town's eastern edge. The second approaches from the south through Bohoyavlenka, following a depression in the terrain that offers some cover from direct fire. Both corridors converge near the mine complex's outer perimeter. Both were extensively mined, observed by drone, and covered by pre-registered anti-tank positions before the first Russian assault ever began. The 79th's defense was not improvised. That is the first and most important thing to understand. Ukrainian commanders had weeks, and in some sectors months, to prepare the ground. Anti-tank ditches were dug across the approach corridors. Mines, both TM-62 anti-tank mines and newer Ukrainian-produced variants, were laid in overlapping fields extending hundreds of meters in front of each defensive line. Anti-tank missile teams with Stugna-P launchers, a Ukrainian-produced laser-guided system with a range of up to 5 kilometers, were emplaced in hardened positions inside the mine buildings and at the bases of the slag heaps. Drone overwatch, initially using commercial Mavic quadcopters and later more capable military systems, was established over every likely avenue of approach. Russia had armor, Ukraine had terrain, and at Vuhledar, the terrain was worth 3 brigades. The first major assault began in late January 2023. Ukrainian drone operators captured footage that would be geolocated, verified, and compiled by OSINT analysts over the following weeks. What the footage showed was a pattern so consistent, it became almost a signature of Russian operational thinking at this stage of the war. Columns of armored vehicles, BMPs, BTRs, and T-72 tanks advancing along the road corridors without adequate reconnaissance, without mine-clearing vehicles at the front, and without infantry dismounting to screen the flanks. The first vehicles would strike mines. The column would stop. Vehicles behind would attempt to maneuver around the stricken lead elements. They would either strike additional mines or drive into pre-registered Stugna-P engagement zones. Within minutes, what had been a coherent armored thrust became a collection of burning hulks blocking the road, trapping the vehicles behind them. Drone operators then guided additional strikes onto the immobilized vehicles and the infantry trying to dismount in the open. This is the kill chain the 79th had engineered, and it worked with devastating consistency. I spent considerable time going through the geolocated footage from this period, cross-referencing Ukrainian drone videos with Oryx's vehicle loss documentation and Maxar satellite imagery of the approach corridors. One detail kept appearing that doesn't get enough attention. The Russians kept using the same roads, not variations of the same approach, the same physical road surface, sometimes within days of the previous failed assault. The craters from earlier destroyed vehicles were visible in the satellite imagery. The burnt-out wrecks were still there, sometimes pushed to the verge, sometimes not. And Russian columns were driving past them toward the same minefields. This wasn't incompetence in the conventional sense. It was an operational culture that prioritized maintaining pressure over learning from losses. Russian brigade and regimental commanders were under orders to keep attacking. The alternative, telling Moscow the assault had failed and requesting permission to pause and regroup, carried its own professional risks. So they attacked again. And the 79th was waiting. By the end of January 2023, Oryx had confirmed the destruction of over 30 Russian armored vehicles in the Vuhledar axis in that month alone. The actual number was almost certainly higher. Oryx counts only losses documented in geolocated, verifiable imagery, and not every destroyed vehicle is photographed and posted publicly. Ukrainian General Staff, reporting from the same period, suggested total Russian armored vehicle losses in the Vuhledar direction had exceeded 130 vehicles since active operations began there in autumn 2022. Here's the part that doesn't make sense on the surface. Russia had air power. The 155th Brigade had artillery. They had access to Lancet loitering munitions, which had been devastating Ukrainian equipment in other sectors. Why couldn't they suppress the Ukrainian defensive positions enough to enable an armored breakthrough? The answer involves the minefields, the terrain, and a Ukrainian adaptation that deserves much more attention than it gets. The integration of drone reconnaissance with pre-positioned anti-tank fires. What the 79th developed at Vuhledar was not revolutionary in any theoretical sense. Mobile defense in depth, using prepared positions with overlapping fields of fire and the ability to shift forces laterally in response to breakthrough attempts, appears in Soviet-era military manuals and NATO equivalents alike. What was different was the execution. Cheap commercial drones as a persistent intelligence layer that gave defenders real-time visibility of Russian movements, then that intelligence cueing Stugna-P teams and mortar crews onto targets before those targets had even reached the primary defensive line. The slag heaps were central to this. A Ukrainian fire team positioned at the base or on the slope of a 15-meter slag heap has an observation advantage over a vehicle approaching across open steppe that is almost impossible to overcome without precise intelligence about the firing position's exact location. Russian suppression fires were often directed at the estimated position of a Stugna-P team that had already displaced by the time the shells arrived. The teams would fire, move, set up at a new pre-designated position, and fire again. The minefields ensured that Russian vehicles could not rapidly close the distance to suppress the teams directly. The combination of elevated observation, pre-planned positions, and mines created a defensive system where the attacker could not effectively mass without presenting targets, and could not suppress without precise targeting data that Russian reconnaissance was consistently failing to generate. A question worth sitting with. How many armored vehicles can a single defending brigade realistically destroy before its own position becomes untenable? Most NATO planning assumptions would suggest a well-equipped defending formation can impose roughly a 3-to-1 loss ratio on an attacking force before reaching its own culminating point. Keep that number in mind as we walk through what actually happened at Vuhledar, because the 79th's ratio was considerably higher. What that tells you about industrial terrain is part of the point. The second major Russian assault wave, beginning in early February 2023, included what Ukrainian and Western analysts assessed as an attempt to commit more significant armored forces in a shorter time window, essentially trying to overwhelm the minefields and defensive fires through speed and mass rather than precision. Ukrainian drone footage from the first week of February captured a column that Oryx would later verify as including T-72B3 tanks, BMP-3 infantry fighting vehicles, and MTLB armored personnel carriers advancing in a formation of at least 35 vehicles along the Mykilsky corridor. The column hit mines approximately 600 meters from the outer defensive line. Lead vehicles stopped. The column compressed. The 79th's anti-tank teams opened fire simultaneously from multiple positions on the slag heap perimeter. The footage is one of the most analyzed pieces of combat video from this entire phase of the war. It shows, in sequence, a tank traversing its turret to engage a threat on the right flank, while simultaneously a Stugna-P round impacts its engine deck from the left. A BMP-3 attempts to reverse and collides with the vehicle behind it. An MTLB carrying infantry drives off the road edge, attempting to bypass a burning tank, and rolls partially onto its side. The infantry dismounts into a minefield. Within 11 minutes of the first mine strike, 17 vehicles in the column are confirmed destroyed or disabled in the footage alone. That is not atypical for a bad day in armored warfare. What made it extraordinary was the repetition. What this operational sequence reveals is the relationship between institutional culture and battlefield learning. Russia's failure at Vuhledar was not primarily a material failure. They had sufficient armor, artillery, and manpower to have attempted the operation differently. It was a failure of adaptation. Senior commanders had information suggesting that frontal armored assaults along predictable corridors were producing catastrophic losses. The satellite imagery showing burnt-out vehicles was available to anyone with a commercial subscription. The Ukrainian drone footage was being broadcast on social media in near real time. Russian units on the ground were presumably reporting what was happening to them. And yet the assaults continued in essentially the same form, using essentially the same corridors, week after week. Here's a take that will probably generate some pushback. The 155th Naval Infantry Brigade's failure at Vuhledar was as much a failure of the officers who ordered the assaults as of the soldiers who carried them out. Those soldiers died and were wounded in attacks that their own commanders had access to enough information to know were unlikely to succeed. The decision to continue frontal armored assaults against a prepared defense with established minefields, without adequate mine-clearing capability, and without the reconnaissance necessary to locate and suppress anti-tank positions before advancing, was a decision made by people with rank. That accountability matters, not for moral reasons alone, but because understanding where the failure originated is the only way to understand why it kept happening. The minefields deserve a dedicated look, because they were not simply a passive obstacle. The 79th and supporting engineer units maintained and adapted them throughout the defensive period. As Russian forces discovered and began to navigate around certain mined areas, engineers would extend fields laterally or establish new minelets in the routes that Russian vehicles had begun to use. This required continuous drone reconnaissance to observe Russian vehicle tracks and patterns, combined with the ability to deploy mine-laying teams at night to adapt the obstacle plan. It was dynamic obstacle management, and it was one of the factors that prevented Russian forces from ever finding a consistent approach route. The Stugna-P system, built by the Luch Design Bureau in Kyiv, performed above expectations at Vuhledar. With a maximum range of 5,000 meters against stationary targets and approximately 3,500 meters against moving ones, guided by a laser beam riding system with a thermal channel for night operations, the Stugna-P allowed Ukrainian teams to engage Russian vehicles at distances where return fire was difficult to direct accurately. The system had been in Ukrainian service since the early 2010s, designed partly in response to lessons from the 2014-2015 fighting in Donbas. By the time of the full-scale invasion, Ukrainian crews had extensive training time on the system. At Vuhledar, that training translated into engagement after engagement, where Russian vehicles were struck before their crews realized they were within range of direct fire weapons. If you've been following this conflict seriously, and if you're watching this analysis, you have been, here is why Vuhledar specifically matters beyond the immediate tactical outcome. It is one of the clearest documented examples of the correlation between prepared defensive terrain and exchange ratios. The 79th was not better equipped in any straightforward sense. Russia had more tanks, more artillery shells, more aircraft available in the theater. What Ukraine had was time to prepare the ground, doctrinal flexibility to develop the mobile defense-in-depth approach, and an institutional culture that learned rapidly from each engagement and adapted. The slag heaps and mine buildings didn't win the battle. The brigade that understood how to use them did. By mid-February 2023, the pattern at Vuhledar had become sufficiently well established that Western military analysts were publishing assessments. The Institute for the Study of War and multiple European defense analysis organizations noted that Russian armored losses in the Vuhledar axis had reached a scale affecting the operational capabilities of the 155th Brigade. Intercepted communications, referenced in Ukrainian General Staff reporting and consistent with patterns described by Ukrainian intelligence officials, suggested that Russian unit commanders were reporting difficulties maintaining assault capability due to equipment attrition and manpower losses. One intercepted communication described to Ukrainian journalists referred to the Vuhledar axis as a road leading nowhere that everyone is being ordered to drive down. That description, whatever its precise source, was operationally accurate. The third and final major assault attempt in this period came in late February 2023, timed, Russian commanders apparently hoped, to coincide with a broader operational push across multiple sectors of the Donbas front designed to generate Ukrainian command overload. The logic wasn't entirely without merit. If the 79th had to respond to threats in multiple directions simultaneously, it might thin its defensive coverage enough to allow a breakthrough in one sector. This attempt also failed, though it was the closest Russia came to generating genuine pressure. A Russian force, assessed by Ukrainian military analysts as including elements of both the 155th and 40th Brigades, attempted a two-axis push, the Mykilsky Corridor and the Bohoyavlenka approach simultaneously, in conditions of poor visibility due to weather. The fog and overcast limited Ukrainian drone operations, which was the first time Russian forces had achieved even partial degradation of the overhead intelligence layer. The southern approach via Bohoyavlenka made initial progress, with Russian vehicles reaching within approximately 800 meters of the outer mine belt before conditions improved enough for Ukrainian drone operators to re-establish coverage. What happened next shows how robust the 79th's defensive system actually was. Returning drone coverage allowed operators to guide Stugna-P teams and mortar fires onto the lead vehicles of the southern column before they could reach breaching distance of the inner mine belt.
The reason is clear.
At the same time, the eastern column along the Mikilsky Road encountered the same minefield combination that had stopped previous assaults. With both axes stalled and daylight improving, Ukrainian drone operators began methodically directing fire onto immobilized vehicles. By the time the assault was called off, Russian forces had lost an estimated additional 20-plus vehicles in the two-day operation and achieved no territorial gain. The two-axis assault, Russia's most sophisticated attempt to overwhelm the Vuhledar defenses, had spent itself against the minefields and slag heaps. What nobody on the Ukrainian side quite anticipated yet was how dramatically this failure would cascade into the broader Russian operational picture across the southern Donbas. The scale of Russian armored vehicle losses at Vuhledar represents one of the most concentrated documented instances of tank and IFV destruction on a single axis in the entire war. By the end of February 2023, Oryx had confirmed the destruction of over 130 Russian armored vehicles in the Vuhledar direction since January 1st of that year, a period of roughly 8 weeks. To put that in financial context, a T-72B3 tank carries an estimated replacement cost of approximately $3 million. A BMP-3 infantry fighting vehicle runs approximately $1 to $1.5 million. Conservative calculations based on the Oryx-confirmed vehicle type breakdown suggest Russia lost over $300 million in armored equipment in the Vuhledar axis in those 8 weeks, in exchange for no territorial gain. The 155th Naval Infantry Brigade's operational capability was, according to multiple Western and Ukrainian assessments, significantly degraded. The unit had entered the Vuhledar operations as a professional naval infantry formation with full equipment tables and trained crews. By March 2023, it was being described in leaked Russian military social media communications as requiring substantial reconstitution before it could conduct further offensive operations. Russian mill bloggers, the semi-official ecosystem of pro-Russian commentators who often publish operational criticism that official channels suppress, were openly describing the 155th's Vuhledar campaign as a catastrophic failure. One prominent Russian mill blogger wrote in late February 2023 that the brigade had been ground up in Vuhledar like meat through a grinder, language that echoed what Ukrainian defenders had been saying about their own doctrinal intent for months. The satellite imagery from this period tells the story more clinically. Maxar imagery of the primary approach corridors shows burn marks and debris fields spread across hundreds of meters of steppe and roadway. Some are concentrated at the points where mine strikes stopped columns. Others are scattered across open ground where vehicles attempted to maneuver around obstacles. Taken together, the imagery looks less like a battlefield and more like an industrial accident, which in a sense is exactly what it was. Russia had fed a modern armored force into a terrain feature shaped over centuries of coal mining to be almost impossible to assault from the ground. Will Russia attempt similar frontal armor assaults against prepared industrial terrain again? Comment yes or no, because the evidence from later 2023 and 2024 suggests the answer is more complicated than either. Old habits and command cultures die hard, especially when the institutional incentives that produced those habits remain in place. The doctrinal lessons from Vuhledar spread through the Ukrainian military with notable speed. The combination of layered mine obstacles, elevated observation from industrial terrain features, Stugna-P, and other anti-tank guided missile systems in pre-positioned hardened firing points, and persistent drone overwatch became a template referenced explicitly in Ukrainian tactical publications and training programs in 2023. Commanders in other sectors of the Donbas front who faced similar terrain, the industrial areas around Avdiivka, the mine infrastructure near Donetsk, the spoil heaps of the Horlivka region, studied Vuhledar, and adapted its principles to their own ground. One detail that stuck with me while studying this case is a small tactical adaptation the 79th appears to have developed specifically in response to Russian counter-drone measures. As Russian forces increasingly deployed electronic warfare systems designed to disrupt commercial drone frequencies, Ukrainian drone operators began using pre-planned flight routes that allowed them to maintain surveillance even when communication links were intermittent. The drone would fly a programmed pattern over the approach corridor, transmitting imagery on whatever frequency windows were available, with operators picking up footage during the communication windows and directing fire based on the last known position data. It was a practical solution to a jamming problem, and it meant that degrading Ukrainian drone operations required sustained electronic warfare coverage across a broad area, an expensive and logistically demanding commitment that Russian forces in the Vuhledar sector could not maintain consistently. The 79th's approach also demonstrated something important about the interaction between morale and operational method. A defending force that has confidence in its defensive system, that has tested it, refined it, and seen it produce results, fights differently from one that is improvising under pressure. The Stugna-P teams at Vuhledar knew their engagement zones. They knew where the mines were. They knew their displacement routes. They had rehearsed the coordinated fire plans. When Russian armor appeared in the engagement areas, there was no hesitation and no improvisation. Just the execution of prepared plans against a target set that was behaving almost exactly as the defensive design had anticipated. That certainty produces a kind of combat effectiveness that is difficult to quantify but unmistakable in its effects. For contrast, consider the Russian forces' experience. Crews in the lead vehicles of a column entering the Vuhledar approaches had been told, presumably, that mine clearing was being conducted, or that the previous column had found a passable route, or that suppression fires were being delivered. And then the first vehicle struck a mine. The column stopped. Fires began coming from the slag heaps to the left and right. The vehicles behind were too close to maneuver. Smoke from burning vehicles ahead obscured visibility. The radio was full of confused reports. The training for this scenario, taking catastrophic vehicle losses in a prepared killing ground while unable to identify firing positions, is not something that armored formation exercises typically emphasize. And it showed. Historically, this pattern, a technically capable attacking force repeatedly failing against a prepared defense in industrial terrain, has analogues worth examining. The fighting in the Ruhr industrial region in early 1945, where Allied forces encountered prepared German defenses using factory buildings and slag heaps in ways that slowed mechanized advances and imposed disproportionate losses. The urban industrial fighting around Seoul during the Korean War, where UN forces discovered that modern city and factory infrastructure created defensive advantages that conventional field fortification could not replicate. Do you think history is repeating itself here, or does drone technology fundamentally change what industrial terrain can do for a defender? That question, and where it leads for how we think about industrial landscapes as strategic assets, is worth sitting with. The Vuhledar defense ultimately ended not with a Ukrainian defeat in the conventional sense, but with a gradual Russian encirclement made possible by pressure on other sectors of the Donbas front through late 2023 and into 2024. Russian forces, unable to capture the town through frontal assault, shifted to slow envelopment, advancing along the flanks at Pavlivka to the north and through the steppe to the south, gradually compressing Ukrainian supply lines to the town. By October 2024, the 79th Brigade and supporting units conducted a fighting withdrawal from Vuhledar as the supply situation became untenable, having held the position for over 2 years. The withdrawal was orderly, a reflection of the brigade's professional competence, and the defensive lines were re-established further west. Russian forces entered a largely destroyed town. They did not achieve the operational breakthrough that the assault on Vuhledar had been intended to enable. The town's fall came not because the 79th's defensive system was overcome, it was not, but because the broader operational context changed around it. That distinction matters enormously for how we assess Vuhledar's significance. The 79th Brigade held a position that Russian commanders designated as a priority objective against professional assault forces with significant material advantages for over 2 years, while inflicting losses so severe they effectively removed multiple Russian brigade-level formations from offensive capability. The defensive doctrine developed and refined at Vuhledar, layered mine obstacles, elevated anti-tank positions in hardened industrial structures, persistent drone overwatch, dynamic obstacle management, and mobile fire teams using pre-planned displacement routes, is now part of the institutional knowledge of the Ukrainian military. It has been studied, published, and applied in defensive operations across the Donbas. The industrial geography of eastern Ukraine, the slag heaps, the mine head frames, the reinforced concrete processing facilities, was never designed as a military asset. It was built over a century of coal extraction to serve an industrial economy. But in the hands of a defending brigade with the doctrinal flexibility to understand what terrain gives you and the tactical discipline to use it properly, it became something else. A force multiplier that allowed one brigade to impose losses on multiple Russian brigades, hold strategic ground for 2 years, and generate doctrinal lessons that continue to shape how Ukraine defends the Donbas. Could Russia have avoided this disaster? 3 questions worth considering. First, could Russia have broken through Vuhledar if it had committed proper mine-clearing assets and conducted the combined arms-breaching operations that its own doctrine prescribes? Probably yes, at significantly higher cost, and possibly with the outcome of capturing a position of reduced value once heavily contested. But the consistent failure to do so points to a capability gap in Russian combined arms integration that went far beyond Vuhledar. Second, what does the Vuhledar experience suggest for NATO defensive planning in the industrial regions of Eastern Europe, where similar terrain features exist in Poland, the Baltic states, and along the old industrial corridors of Central Europe? The lesson that pre-prepared industrial terrain combined with modern anti-tank guided missiles and persistent drone overwatch can produce exchange ratios that conventional force correlation models don't predict should be reshaping defensive planning right now. Third, as Russia continues to adapt its assault tactics, using glide bombs, Lancet drones, and infantry infiltration rather than massed armor columns, how does Ukraine adapt this doctrine to address threats that come from above and from small dismounted units rather than armored columns in predictable corridors? That adaptation is happening. Understanding it is what this channel does every week. If this kind of detailed OSINT breakdown, the unit-level analysis, the terrain geometry, the doctrinal implications, is what you want to keep seeing, subscribe to Frontline Truth. We go through the satellite imagery, the verified loss data, the intercepted communications, so you don't have to. Every week, a new case. Every case, the evidence first. The 79th Brigade held Vuhledar with coal dust and concrete and mines and the knowledge of how to use all 3. What Russia sent against them burned on the steppe. The slag heaps are still there.